want to just do a little overview of where we're going tonight. We're going to look at discerning between demonic presence and immaturity. And I said last session that you can't heal a demon and you can't cast out immaturity. You can't counsel a demon. They don't respond well to that. And I can almost picture the demons just sitting laughing because they think they're going to get us out by counseling. And it doesn't work that way. So we're going to look at all of that tonight. We're going to look at developing discernment, because discernment, according to the Bible, is what we need in order to distinguish between what is an issue of the soul and what is an issue of the heart or spirit. So we're going to look at how we develop discernment. 4 common, I call them malignant spirits. The word malignant most often is used in relation to tumors and things, but the word actually means, if you look it up in the dictionary, it means overwhelming evil or progressive evil. Malignant spirits do just that, attempt to overwhelm the believers with thoughts and actions that aren't becoming to a believer and draw them away from God. There are 4 that, just in my experience, most common: fear, abandonment, rebellion, and shame. And we're going to look at each of those in a bit of detail. Then we're going to look at steps to freedom, how we can lead someone step at a time into freedom. Freedom from issues of immaturity and freedom from demonic presence. 2 entirely different things. In that process, we're going to look at signs of demonic harassment. What sort of things indicate that there might be a demonic presence at work here? Then we're going to look at freedom prayer, how to pray into people who we believe are being harassed by demonic presence. And then a very important part of that is we're going to look at maintaining freedom. I've known people who have been set free, but then aren't ready to accept the responsibility of being free. And that's a huge issue because there's almost no point in praying for freedom for someone if they're not prepared to take on the responsibility of maintaining freedom and growing in the freedom. So we're going to look at that. And then lastly, we want to look at activation. By that I mean tangible reminders that people can make that remind them of what has taken place. And there's a lot of biblical support for that idea, and we're going to look at that. Discerning between demonic presence and immaturity. As we said, you can't heal a demon, you can't cast out immaturity. This is why discernment is so important. It helps us understand, and the people that we're dealing with, what we're dealing with. Issues of the soul, as I said, may respond to wise counseling, but demons are spiritual entities and can only be dealt with in a spiritual manner. And we see scriptural backing for that. 2 Corinthians 10, 4-5. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. And then in Ephesians 6, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, rulers of darkness, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So that's why we need to understand spiritual warfare when we're helping someone who is coming under harassment from the enemy. So let's talk about developing spiritual discernment. Deuteronomy 11:18, you shall therefore lay up these words of mine in both your heart and your soul. Okay? And here again, we've talked about the various roles of the soul and the spirit, and different roles. They're both very important in our life, but they do have very distinct roles. And so we're instructed here to lay up or store up these words both in our soul and in our spirit. Learning things with our mind is important, but spiritual understanding is not complete without storing them in our heart as well as in our soul. 1 Corinthians 2:14, the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him. Neither can he know them because they are spiritually discerned. So understanding how the demonic presence can get close to us is a very important step in preventing it from happening again. And we talked last session, actually in the very first session, we talked about the open door idea. We have protective fences around us that are put in place by God. When we come to Jesus, there is kind of a built-in protection, but the enemy will hammer away at that. And if we don't maintain the fence, if we don't rebuild the things that are broken and maintain what there is, then eventually a weak spot will form in that fence just from repeatedly hammering on it. And once there's a hole in the fence or an open door, it leaves us wide open for spiritual harassment. Discerning of spirits is a spiritual gift in 2 Corinthians 12. There are a number of purposes for it. To see and understand what is happening in the spiritual realm, or in the spirit realm, in other words, to perceive what is unseen, to recognize the source of spirits, to detect hidden evil, and also to detect hidden good. There are people who have gifts that they're not walking in. There are things that God has given them to increase their impact in the world, but things have crowded in and kept them locked away in a cupboard. And so that's an important concept of spiritual gifting. And it helps us understand the thoughts, the dreams, the visions, prophecies, and so on. And the last point about spiritual gift is that it can be stirred up or awakened. And it's interesting that Paul said to Timothy, stir up the gift that is of God that is within you by the laying on of my hands. It's not talking about new gifts here. It's talking about stirring up the gifts that are already within you. And I believe that God puts discernment. I believe that's one of the gifts that he gives to people very broadly. And we have a responsibility to stir it up and to understand how it works and to venture out in it. In my journey in learning to play the banjo, I started when I was, I think, 67. And I started playing the banjo. And there came a day when I had to step out and play in a group. It was scary, but I did it. Made a couple of mistakes, but that was okay. I don't know that anybody heard them. They were so loud that I don't know if anybody heard me playing even, but I heard it. But as I did it more, I became more comfortable with it. And I think it's the same with any spiritual gifting. There comes a point where we have to step out and do it. And if it's a gift that we're not familiar with, but we want to walk in it, like discernment, for example, spiritual discernment, I always feel it's a good idea to do it with someone who has more experience in that area. If you're going to pray for someone who you believe has a harassing spirit on them, it's even after you've gained experience with that, it's a good idea, if possible, to have a second person there. It's just really helpful. I've found that. Occasionally I get called from different places and people that I know. I think this person might be dealing with the spirit of something, just being harassed, and could you join us for prayer? And I'm so thankful that there are other people there, mature Christians, who also have insights to share and so on. It's very important. If at all possible, I would suggest don't do it alone. So these 4 common malignant spirits: fear, abandonment, rebellion, and shame. And we're going to start by looking at fear. Normal fear is protective, God's gift to us. When fear becomes a habit, it starts to batter down that protective barrier that we have. And once there's a hole in that barrier, it allows spiritual entities access to us. And once the spirit of fear comes in, it's like other spiritual entities are just waiting for access. Fear often is the first one in, and then the door is wide open, and all kinds of things can come in, and it can be overwhelming. Disabling fear often has a root overprotection. Those of us who are parents all know the tendency to, we want to protect our kids when they're growing up and even as adults, and we don't want anything bad to happen to them. But there's a point where we have to let go. If we don't want to let go, that can produce unrealistic fear in our kids. So it's just something to be aware of. In Hebrews 2, it talks about releasing those who, through fear of death, were for their whole lifetime subject to bondage. Fear of death, just one example of fear. Romans 8:15, for you did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. And we talked in a previous session about the spirit of adoption and how that counteracts the spirit of abandonment, which is what we're going to be talking about next. A number of years ago, I was doing a practitioner locum in a small community up the coast of BC, a little fly-in village. And I was on call one night, and I got a call saying that there's a woman at the church, and we don't know what's wrong with her, but something's wrong. Could you get out here right away? So I grabbed my bag and went down there, and there's this woman sitting on the steps of the church, and she's just sobbing and carrying on, and I didn't really understand spiritual warfare at that time. But I had a bit of a grasp on emergency medicine, and so I administered a sedative and then an antihypertensive because I checked her blood pressure and it was through the roof. And so I got her settled down pharmacologically, and then I said to her, tomorrow morning you need to come into the clinic and we'll do a more thorough assessment and see what's going on here. She came in and I said to her, what do you think is happening? And she said, I can't be alone. And I said, well, tell me about that. She told me an incredibly sad story of when she was a little girl. Her parents would go out on their fishing boat and they would leave her uncle in charge of her. And this uncle always, every time, would abuse her sexually and would frighten her into not telling her parents because he said that bad things would happen to her. They don't need to know about this. And this went on for 3 years. And finally, somebody figured it out and told the parents, and the uncle ended up going to prison. But she felt abandoned again because her parents weren't there to protect her. And she felt she could not be left alone. So when she went to this do at the church, she had a friend walk with her. She's only 2 blocks from the church. But the friend wasn't feeling well and told her, I'm not feeling well, I've got to leave, and left. And it just didn't register with her that she was going to have to walk home alone now, 2 blocks. And it just terrified her, and she went into this massive panic attack, and all traced back down to abuse and a feeling of abandonment. She couldn't be alone. John 14:18, and we read this last time, I will not leave you as orphans. You've received the spirit of adoption whereby we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit itself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ.